The north wind carried heavy snow across the valley, burying the long gravel driveway of the mountain estate under a thick white blanket. Victor Lancaster walked slowly down the path toward the outer iron gates, his long dark wool coat moving around his ankles with every step he took. The freezing air did not seem to bother him, and the snowflakes that landed on his stark white hair did not melt right away. His skin was unusually pale, almost matching the color of the drifts around his boots, reflecting the cold light of the moon. He stopped near the edge of his property, his sharp eyes catching a shape that did not belong in the winter landscape. A few yards away, partially covered by the soft powder, was a large bundle of white silk and lace that looked out of place against the dark trees. Victor stepped off the cleared path and walked into the deep snow, his movements smooth and silent as he approached the figure. He knelt down and carefully moved a heavy branch out of the way, revealing a young woman curled into a tight ball. She was wearing a wedding dress, but the elegant fabric was torn at the bottom and soaked through with gray slush. Her face was turning a dangerous shade of blue, and her dark hair was frozen into stiff strands across her forehead. Victor reached out with a pale hand and pressed 2 fingers against the side of her neck, searching for any sign of life. A very faint pulse beat against his fingertips, slow and weak, like a clock running out of power. He did not hesitate or wait for the winter storm to worsen in the night air. Victor slipped one arm under her shoulders and the other beneath her knees, lifting her out of the frozen hollow with no visible effort. Her head fell back against his shoulder, her skin so cold it felt like ice through the fabric of his heavy shirt. As he walked back toward the large stone house, he noticed a sharp scent beneath the smell of cold water and pine needles. It was the scent of fear, mixed with the faint odor of cheap whiskey and old smoke that hung around her torn clothes. He kept his pace steady, his boots biting into the fresh snow, as he carried her up the wide stone steps of the front porch. He kicked the heavy oak door open, stepping into the warm, dimly lit entrance hall, where a massive fireplace cast long orange shadows on the walls. An elderly woman with gray hair wrapped in a neat bun hurried out from the back kitchen, wiping her hands on a white apron. This was Martha, who had managed the household affairs at the estate for more than 20 years without complaint. She stopped short when she saw the frozen woman in Victor's arms, her eyes widening as she took in the ruined wedding gown. Victor did not give her time to ask questions, keeping his voice low but completely firm as he moved toward the wide staircase. "Set up the corner bedroom on the 2nd floor immediately," Victor said, his voice deep and smooth as it cut through the quiet room. "Bring up a mountain of dry blankets, heated bricks from the hearth, and several large basins of warm water." Martha nodded quickly, her initial shock turning into practical efficiency within a single second, as she turned back toward the kitchen to give orders to the younger staff. Victor carried the unconscious woman up the stairs, his grip secure, as he entered the quiet guest room at the end of the long hallway. He laid her down gently onto the mattress of the 4-poster bed, being careful not to catch the delicate lace of her dress on the wooden edges. The yellow lamplight allowed him to see her face clearly for the first time since he found her in the dark woods. She looked to be about 24 years old, with sharp features that were currently twisted into a slight grimace of pain even in her sleep. A dark, ugly bruise was beginning to form along her left cheekbone, stretching down toward her jaw in a shape that could only come from a heavy blow. Victor touched the edge of the mark with his thumb, his jaw tightening as he realized this injury was not caused by a fall in the woods. Someone had hit her with a closed fist before she ran out into the freezing night. Martha entered the room a moment later, followed by a young assistant named Samuel, who carried 2 heavy buckets of steaming water. They worked quietly around the bed, treating the frozen stranger with the kind of calm care that came from years of living far away from city hospitals. Victor stepped back into the darker corner of the room, near the heavy velvet curtains, giving them space to change her into dry clothes. As Martha pulled the wet sleeves away from the woman's hands, a glint of gold caught the lamplight from the nightstand. Victor looked closer and saw a heavy wedding band on her left ring finger, engraved with a distinct design. The gold ring showed a small hawk with its wings spread wide, an emblem that Victor knew better than his own family history. It was the crest of the Montgomery family, a wealthy name from the city that had once held massive influence in the state's rail industry. Victor walked slowly toward the frosted glass of the large window, his pale reflection staring back at him from the dark pane. 5 years ago, he had used his immense wealth and legal resources to systematically take apart the financial empire of Richard Montgomery. The older man had crossed a line that Victor could not ignore, breaking a promise that had cost the lives of innocent workers. Victor had been patient and thorough in his legal revenge, buying up every debt the Montgomery family owed and ensuring every bank closed its doors to them. He had wanted the older man to feel the cold reality of losing everything, to know what it was like to be helpless in the face of ruin. But he had never intended for that suffering to touch the man's young daughter, who had been away at school during the entire trial. The gossip columns from the city had mentioned a quick marriage between the daughter and a wealthy local politician named Arthur Pendleton. It was a deal made to save the family from public shame, a trade of a daughter's life for a clean ledger. Victor turned back toward the bed as Martha finished wrapping the young woman in 3 layers of thick wool blankets. The housekeeper placed a warm cloth over the bruised cheek, shaking her head as she looked down at the pale face on the pillow. "She will live through the night, sir, but her skin is still far too cold to the touch," Martha whispered as she stepped away from the bed. "She has 2 cracked ribs on her left side, and the bruises on her arms suggest she was held down by someone very strong." Victor nodded slowly, his white hair catching the firelight as he pointed toward the door, signaling for his staff to rest. The smell of dried lavender and hot pine wood woke her up long before she could open her heavy eyelids against the morning light. Chloe Montgomery tried to move her legs, but the thick wool blankets felt like lead weights across her body, pinning her to the mattress. A sharp pain flared up along her left ribs when she took a deep breath, forcing a small gasp from her dry lips. She opened her eyes slowly, blinking at the high plaster ceiling and the dark wood beams that looked nothing like her father's house. The room was massive and completely still, filled with heavy furniture and oil paintings of gray mountain ranges that she had never seen before. "You should remain still for a while longer," a voice said from the shadows near the far side of the crackling fireplace. The voice was cold and perfectly measured, yet it carried a strange weight that made Chloe turn her head despite the pain in her neck. A man sat in a high-backed leather chair, his long legs crossed at the ankle, as he watched her with total focus. He wore a simple black shirt, with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing arms that were as white as marble. His hair was completely white, falling in clean lines around a face that looked like it had been carved from winter ice. "Where am I?" Chloe asked, her throat feeling like dry sand as she struggled to form the words clearly. She tried to sit up, but the pain in her side was too intense, forcing her back onto the white pillows. "You are at the Lancaster estate, just outside the small town of Crestview," the white-haired man replied as he stood up from his chair. "My name is Victor Lancaster, and my groundskeeper found you frozen in a snowdrift near the main road last night." Chloe felt a sudden wave of cold fear hit her stomach, a feeling that had nothing to do with the winter weather outside. She knew the name Lancaster from the hushed, angry arguments her father used to have behind locked doors in their city townhouse. Victor Lancaster was the silent force that had bought up their mortgages, canceled their credits, and left her father begging for extensions from local banks. He was the man her father blamed for every single misfortune that had fallen upon their family over the last 5 years. Chloe looked at his pale skin and his dark eyes, realizing she had run away from one danger only to land in the home of her family's greatest enemy. She instinctively pulled her hands under the blanket, hiding the gold ring. "I see that you recognize my name," Victor said quietly, taking 3 slow steps toward the edge of the large wooden bed. He did not look angry or satisfied, his face remaining perfectly calm as he looked down at her bruised cheek. "I know who your father is, Chloe, but I do not know why his daughter is running through a blizzard in a torn wedding dress." The question was direct, spoken without any of the fake politeness she was used to hearing from the wealthy men in her father's social circle. Chloe looked away from his gaze, her fingers tightening around the rough wool of the heavy blanket. I was not running from the wedding itself, Chloe said after a long silence, her voice trembling slightly as she remembered the previous night. I was running from the man my father forced me to marry at the altar yesterday afternoon. Victor did not interrupt her, simply standing by the bedside with his arms crossed as he waited for her to continue. Arthur Pendleton does not like to be questioned about his business or his personal companions, she whispered, her eyes fixing on the wood grain of the floorboards. When I asked him about the missing family funds during the dinner, he became very angry. The memory came back in sharp, painful pieces that made her heart race against her damaged ribs in the quiet room. Arthur had taken her by the arm and pulled her into the empty library of the hotel, his face red from drinking too much champagne. He told her that her father had sold her to him to clear a debt of $50,000, and that she belonged to him now. When she tried to open the door to leave, he had struck her across the face with his ringed hand, knocking her against the heavy table. He told her that the wedding night would teach her how to be a proper wife. I waited until he went back to the main hall to drink with his political friends, Chloe said, a tear finally sliding down her cold nose. I slipped out through the kitchen doors and ran into the trees behind the hotel property without looking back once. I did not care about the cold or the dark. I just knew I could not let him touch me again. Victor remained perfectly still, but Chloe noticed that the skin over his knuckles had turned completely white as his hands clenched into fists. The air in the room seemed to drop several degrees in an instant, the fire in the hearth flickering low. Your father allowed this to happen to you, Victor stated, his voice dropping to a very low whisper that sounded like ice cracking. He knew what kind of man Arthur Pendleton was before he signed the marriage papers in the city. Chloe nodded slowly, her head aching from the movement as she looked back up at the mysterious master of the house. My father only cares about his reputation and the money he lost during the lawsuit 5 years ago, she said bitterly. He told me that a good daughter would do whatever was necessary to keep her family out of the public bankruptcy courts. Victor walked over to the small table near the bed and picked up a glass of clear water, handing it to her with a steady hand. Drink this, he said simply, his dark eyes meeting hers with a look that was surprisingly gentle despite his cold appearance. You are safe in this house, Chloe, and neither your father nor your new husband will set foot on this mountain while I am here. Chloe took the glass, her fingers brushing against his cold skin, wondering why her family's enemy was the only person who had protected her. She drank the water quickly, feeling the cold liquid soothe her throat as the winter sun began to rise. 4 days passed before Chloe was strong enough to leave the warmth of the second-floor bedroom and walk down the wide stairs. Her ribs still ached when she moved too quickly, but Martha had given her a loose wool dress and a pair of soft leather slippers. The house was incredibly quiet during the daylight hours, with most of the thick velvet curtains drawn tight against the bright winter sun. She rarely saw Victor during the morning or afternoon, though she often heard his slow, measured footsteps in the hallways above her. Martha explained that the master of the house preferred to do his business and writing after the sun went down behind the mountains. Chloe spent her afternoons in the grand library on the first floor, a massive room filled with thousands of leather-bound books that smelled of old paper. She sat in a large green chair near the small fireplace, reading about the history of the valley and trying to forget her past. On the 5th evening, as the clock on the wall struck 7, Victor entered the library with a small tray of food. He set the plate of roasted chicken and warm bread on the table beside her chair, taking his usual seat opposite her. He did not bring a plate for himself, holding only a tall glass filled with a very dark red liquid. You look much better than you did on the night you arrived, Victor said, his sharp eyes scanning her face where the blue bruise was turning yellow. The quiet life up here seems to suit your recovery, though I imagine it is very different from the city. Chloe took a small piece of the warm bread, nodding as she looked out the dark window at the falling snow. It is much quieter here, and for the first time in 5 years, I do not feel like someone is watching me for a scandal, she said. The city always felt like a cage, especially after my father lost his business partners and his money. Victor took a slow sip from his glass, his white hair contrasting sharply with the dark green leather of his high-backed chair. A person can live in a cage for a very long time if they believe there are no open doors left for them, he murmured. Chloe watched him closely, noticing that he never seemed to blink or move his hands unless it was completely necessary for an action. "Why do you live all the way out here by yourself, Mr. Lancaster?" she asked, her curiosity getting the better of her natural caution. "A man with your wealth could live in the finest mansion in the city center." "I do not belong in the city, and the people there have a habit of asking too many questions about things they do not understand," Victor replied. He set his glass down on the wooden table with a soft click, his pale face remaining perfectly unreadable in the dim firelight. "I prefer the silence of these old mountains, where the trees do not care about time or the changes in the world below." Chloe finished her meal quietly, feeling a strange sense of comfort in his simple words, even though she knew very little about him. He was a man of few words, but every sentence he spoke felt completely honest and grounded. After Martha cleared the tray away, Victor stayed in the library, watching Chloe as she turned the pages of a thick book about old American architecture. "Do you miss your old life at all, Chloe?" he asked suddenly, his voice breaking the deep silence that had settled between them. Chloe paused, her finger resting on the edge of a paper page as she thought about her answer for a long moment. "I miss the garden my mother kept before she passed away 3 years ago, but I do not miss the people or the constant pressure," she said. "My father spent every single dinner talking about the money you took from him through the court system. He did not take that money from me. He lost it through his own choices and his lack of care for others," Victor said, his tone perfectly flat. Chloe looked up at him, sensing the deep anger that lay just beneath his calm exterior, like hot coals buried under gray ash. "I know he broke a contract with your logging company, but he always claimed it was a simple misunderstanding about the mountain boundaries," she noted. Victor leaned forward slightly, the light from the fire catching the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the strange intensity of his dark eyes. "There are no misunderstandings when men lose their lives because someone wanted to save $10,000 on safety equipment," Victor said coldly. "Your father knew the old mine shafts were unstable, but he ordered the crews to dig anyway because the price of silver was high that winter. 3 men never came back down from that mountain, and your father denied any responsibility to their families until I forced him to pay." Chloe felt a sudden weight drop into her chest, her father's face appearing in her mind not as a victim, but as a man who cared nothing for human life. She had never been told the true story behind the lawsuit that ruined her family name. "I am sorry," Chloe whispered, her voice barely louder than the sound of the wind outside the heavy stone walls of the library. "I did not know about the men who died, or that my father had hidden the truth from everyone in the house." "You have nothing to apologize for, because you were not the one who signed those orders, or lied to the judges," Victor said softly. He stood up from his chair, his tall figure casting a long shadow across the rows of books as he moved toward the door. "Rest well tonight, Chloe, because tomorrow we must begin the work of ensuring your husband can never claim you as his property again." The next morning brought a fierce wind that rattled the thick glass windows of the estate, keeping Chloe indoors for another long day of waiting. She spent her morning helping Martha mend old linen sheets in the sewing room, enjoying the simple rhythm of the needle moving through the white fabric. Martha was a cheerful companion, talking about the local wildlife and the history of the house, though she carefully avoided talking about Victor's personal habits. Chloe noticed that the older woman treated the pale master of the house with a deep respect that looked more like family loyalty than standard employment. By mid-afternoon, Samuel returned from the small town of Crestview, his heavy leather bag filled with papers and letters from the city legal offices. Victor called Chloe into his private study at 8 o'clock that evening, the room filled with the sharp scent of old ink and heavy paper. He was standing behind a large mahogany desk, several official documents spread out beneath his pale hands like pieces of a map. Samuel stood near the window, shaking the snow from his heavy wool cap, as he nodded toward Chloe when she walked through the open door. "We have found the records of Arthur Pendleton's financial dealings from the last 2 years, Victor said without any introduction, pointing to a long list of numbers. Your husband has been using public city funds to pay off his personal gambling debts at the high-stakes clubs near the harbor. He thought his political connections would hide the missing money, but he did not count on my agents looking through his bank ledgers. Chloe walked closer to the desk, her eyes scanning the official stamps and signatures on the official papers that Victor had gathered for her. "Can this information be used to get me away from him legally?" she asked, her hand trembling slightly as she touched the edge of a legal document. In the city, a woman cannot simply leave her husband because he is cruel or because he struck her once during a private argument. This is more than a simple private argument, because he married you under completely false pretenses to secure your father's remaining land assets, Victor explained. The paperwork shows he was already technically bankrupt on the day of your wedding, meaning the marriage contract itself is based on a massive financial fraud. He looked up from the papers, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a cold intensity that made her breath catch in her throat for a second. "My lawyers in the city have already filed a petition for a full annulment with the state court, using this evidence of fraud and his history of physical violence," he said. "Arthur Pendleton will be so busy trying to avoid a long term in the federal prison that he will not have the time or the resource to look for you up here." Chloe felt a sudden sense of lightness in her chest, as if a tight metal band around her ribs had finally snapped open. "Thank you, Victor," she said, using his first name for the very first time since she had arrived at his isolated mountain home. "I do not understand why you are doing all of this for the daughter of a man who caused so much pain to your own partners." Victor stepped around the massive desk, his movements so smooth and silent that he seemed to glide across the thick wool rug. "I am doing this because your father's sins belong to him alone, and I will not allow an innocent person to be used as a shield for his old debts," he said. He stopped a few feet away from her, his pale face reflecting the soft yellow light of the single desk lamp. He reached out his hand, his long fingers hovering near her arm for a second, before he let his hand drop back to his side with a quiet sigh. "There is something else you must understand about me before this business is finished, Chloe," he said, his voice dropping to a very low tone. "The people in the town call me a monster, and they are not entirely wrong about the things I must do to survive in this world." Chloe looked at his white hair and his stark pale skin, realizing that she had never seen him eat a single piece of regular food during their dinners. "I have seen how you treat Martha and Samuel, and I know you saved my life when you could have left me in the snow," Chloe said firmly, stepping closer to him. "A true monster would not spend his time or his money trying to protect a stranger from a cruel man in the city." Victor looked down at her, a small, sad smile touching the corners of his pale lips for a brief moment, before his face became serious again. "The world is full of different kinds of danger, Chloe, and sometimes the things that live in the dark are much safer than the men who smile at you in the bright daylight." The storm outside finally stopped on the 7th day, leaving the mountain valley perfectly white and still under a clear blue sky that felt cold and distant. Chloe walked out onto the wide stone porch for the first time, wrapping a heavy fur coat tightly around her shoulders to keep out the sharp frost. She watched Samuel clear the deep snow from the wooden steps, his heavy boots making a loud crunching sound in the morning air. The silence of the estate was comforting, a sharp contrast to the constant noise of carriages and shouting street vendors that filled the city streets near her father's house. Inside the house, the atmosphere began to change, as the legal wheels in the city started to turn under Victor's silent direction. Every evening, Samuel brought new letters from the lawyers, tracking the progress of the case against Arthur Pendleton as the scandal became public. Chloe spent her evenings with Victor in the large study, watching him write letters to various bank directors and state officials with an old-fashioned fountain pen. Their conversations grew longer and more natural, moving away from the details of the lawsuit toward their personal thoughts about life and the world outside. "I used to think that wealth was the only thing that could keep a person safe from the world," Chloe said one night as she sat near his desk. "My father spent his entire life chasing new investments, but he always seemed more afraid than the men who worked in his rail yards." "Your father chased wealth because he wanted power over other people, not safety for his home," Victor said, without looking up from his writing. True safety comes from knowing exactly who you are and being content with the small circle of people you choose to trust with your life. Chloe studied his pale profile, the way his white hair caught the light from the oil lamp, like fresh snow under a bright moon night. "Do you ever feel lonely up here by yourself, Victor?" she asked softly, her voice carrying a gentle curiosity that did not want to offend him. He paused his pen, a single drop of black ink falling from the metal nib onto the white paper below like a small dark tear. "I have lived for a very long time, Chloe, and I have learned that loneliness is much better than the company of men who hide their true intentions behind pretty words," he replied. He turned his head to look at her, his dark eyes reflecting the yellow flame of the lamp, with a strange, ancient light that made her heart skip a beat. "But these past 2 weeks have been different, and the house has felt less like an empty stone vault since you walked through the front door," he added. Chloe felt her cheeks turn slightly pink, a genuine warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the heat from the stone fireplace. She realized that she was no longer thinking about the city or her old life as something she wanted to find again. Later that night, as she walked back to her bedroom, she saw Victor standing at the end of the long hallway near a wide stained glass window. He was looking out at the moonlit valley, his pale hands resting on the dark wood trim of the frame with total stillness. She stopped a few yards away, watching him as the silver light washed over his white hair and made his skin look almost translucent. He did not turn around, but she knew he was aware of her presence because he spoke her name in a quiet whisper that floated down the corridor. "The court will make their final decision tomorrow morning, Chloe, and by noon, you will be a free woman with no legal ties to the city or the men who hurt you," he said. "You will have enough money from your mother's old trust to live anywhere you like, far away from this mountain and the cold winter storms." Chloe felt a sudden tightness in her throat, the word freedom tasting surprisingly bitter in her mouth as she looked at his solitary figure. She did not answer him right away, turning back to her dark room with a heavy heart that did not want the winter to end. The news arrived exactly at noon on the 9th day, carried by a tired courier who had ridden his horse through the slushy mountain paths from the nearest train station. Samuel brought the official document into the library where Chloe and Victor were waiting, his face covered in a wide smile as he handed the paper to her. The state judge had signed the full annulment papers, stripping Arthur Pendleton of any legal claim to her life or her property. Furthermore, the city police had arrested Pendleton that very morning on charges of grand larceny and fraud, ensuring he would remain behind bars for several years. "Your father has left the city as well," Samuel added, his tone turning serious as he looked at Chloe with a gentle expression. "He sold his remaining shares to pay off his local debts and took a small train down to the southern coast, where nobody knows his name or his history. He did not leave an address or a letter for you, Miss Chloe." Chloe looked down at the official gold seal on the paper in her hands, feeling a strange mix of relief and profound emptiness wash over her. Her old life was completely gone, wiped away in the span of a single winter week by the pale man standing across from her. "You are completely free now, Chloe," Victor said quietly, stepping forward as Samuel left the room and closed the heavy oak doors behind him. "You can pack your things today, and Samuel will drive you down to the station in the morning so you can start your new life in any city you choose." Chloe set the legal document down on the table, her eyes fixing on his pale face with a sudden intensity that seemed to surprise him. "Why are you so anxious to send me away, Victor?" she asked, her voice steady and clear as she walked across the room toward him. "I am not anxious to send you away, but I am an immortal creature who belongs to the dark, and you are a young human woman with a whole life ahead of you," he said. He turned away from her, his white hair shaking slightly as he shook his head against the bright sunlight streaming through the window. "You deserve to live in a place where the sun shines every day, with a man who can walk down the street with you in the middle of the afternoon without hiding his face." Chloe did not stop, closing the remaining distance between them until she was standing directly in front of him, her boots touching his. "I spent 24 years living in the bright daylight, with men who lied to my face and sold me to the highest bidder for a clean bank ledger," she said fiercely. The only place I have ever felt safe, the only place where someone looked at me and saw a real human being, is in this dark house with you." She reached out and took his pale hands in hers, ignoring how cold they felt against her warm skin, locking her fingers tightly with his. Victor looked down at their joined hands, his dark eyes widening as he felt the warmth of her touch move up his arms. "Chloe," he whispered, his voice cracking with an emotion he had not allowed himself to feel for more than 100 years in his solitary life. "You do not know what you are asking for if you choose to stay on this mountain with a creature like me. I know exactly what I am asking for, because I know the man who carried me through a blizzard and spent his fortune to save my life from a monster," she said. She leaned up on her toes, her heart hammering against her healed ribs as she pressed her lips gently against his cold cheek. Victor let out a long breath that sounded like a quiet sigh of relief, his strong arms finally coming around her waist to pull her close against his chest. He kissed her then, a soft, slow movement that carried all the quiet promises and hidden warmth he had kept locked away inside his frozen heart for so many years. The cold isolation of the stone estate seemed to melt away in that single moment, replaced by a quiet light that had nothing to do with the winter sun outside. Chloe closed her eyes, knowing with absolute certainty that she had finally found the home she had been looking for her entire life. 6 months later, the deep snow had entirely disappeared from the mountain slopes, replaced by thick green grass and patches of wild yellow flowers that danced in the mountain breeze. The old stone house at the Lancaster estate looked different now, with many of the heavy velvet curtains drawn back to let the soft evening light into the rooms. Chloe sat on the wide front porch, a small cup of warm, sweet tea resting in her lap, as she watched the sun go down behind the distant blue hills. She wore a simple green cotton dress, her dark hair tied back with a clean ribbon that fluttered slightly in the wind. Samuel was down near the lower barn, leading 2 large workhorses out to the green pasture for the evening after a long day of clearing the mountain trails. Martha worked in the kitchen behind the porch, the cheerful sound of metal pans and the sweet smell of baking apple pies drifting through the open screen door into the quiet yard. The estate was no longer a silent fortress of isolation, but a living home filled with the small, comforting noises of a family that had chosen to live together on their own terms. As the last light of the sun dipped below the horizon, the front door opened quietly, and Victor stepped out onto the porch, his white hair catching the silver twilight. He walked over to her chair and laid a pale hand gently on her shoulder, his fingers warm from the heat of the house, as he looked down at her with a calm smile. "The garden down by the old well is beginning to bloom, Chloe, and the small roses you planted last month are finally showing their first red petals," he said. Chloe reached up and placed her hand over his, feeling the steady, comfortable strength of his presence beside her in the dark. "I think my mother would have liked this garden, because it is much quieter than the one we kept in the city center," she said softly, leaning her head back against his side. Victor nodded, his dark eyes scanning the peaceful valley below them as the first evening stars began to appear in the clear sky above the mountain peak. "We will plant more flowers along the western wall next spring, so you can see them from the library window while you read your books in the afternoon," he promised. They stood together in the deepening twilight, 2 distinct individuals who had been brought together by a cruel twist of revenge and a bitter winter storm. They had both lost the families they were born into, but they had found something much stronger and more permanent in the quiet rooms of the stone house. As the night air settled over the mountain, Victor guided her back inside, closing the heavy oak door against the dark world outside and locking their shared future safely within the warm stone walls. Looking out at the quiet valley, as the moon rose over the pines, Chloe realized that the long winter of her life had finally come to an end. True security was not something that could be bought with gold coins or written into a legal marriage contract by wealthy men in a city office. It was found in the quiet moments of trust between 2 people who had seen the worst parts of the world and decided to protect each other anyway. Her father had spent his entire life running after influence and numbers on a page, yet he had died alone in a strange town far away from the people who loved him. Arthur Pendleton had used his political power like a heavy club to force people into obedience, only to find himself locked in a small concrete cell where his name meant absolutely nothing to the guards. Victor had lived in the dark for a century, hiding his pale skin and his white hair from a world that only cared about appearances and ancient superstitions. Yet his heart was capable of more genuine kindness and protection than all the proper gentlemen who had ever sat at her father's dinner table in the city center. She knew that her choice to stay on this isolated mountain would seem strange to the people she used to know, but those people had never looked beneath the surface of anything. She was no longer a piece of property to be traded, or a victim of a past she could not change. As she watched Victor blow out the last candle in the hallway, she felt a deep sense of peace about the years that lay ahead of them. They would have many more winters on this mountain, but the cold would never be able to touch her inside this house again.